Hi, and welcome to Curious Conversations, the podcast where curiosity meets connection. Thanks for joining as we discuss captivating stories and ideas and engage in thought-provoking conversations with experts, enthusiasts, and everyday people. We hope to ignite a curious spirit as we embark on a quest for understanding, one curious conversation at a time. So let's jump in this together. Welcome to the world of Curious Conversations. Hello, and welcome to Curious Conversations. We are your host, Carly and Mandy, and this week we're talking about a double murder case from Northwest Georgia, which is most often referred to as Corpsewood Manor.
This episode does contain details of the murders and could be disturbing to some listeners, so please be advised. This week we are sharing about the murders of Charles Scudder and Joey Odom, as well as their two beloved bull mastiffs. These men were shot and killed in their own home by two men whom they thought were their friends, Tony West and Kenneth Brock, who often went by the name Avery.
Well, listen, before we dive in, we want to share with you this week's Curious Dish. This is the part of our show where we dish about the most curious thing we've seen this week.
So for this week's Curious Dish, we're going to be sharing an item that we own that ties us to the story of Corpsewood. So I have a photograph of the staircase when it was still, intact. But
yes, you do.
Yeah, you know a little bit about that. So that would have been 93, 94 time period. So there was still quite a bit of the structure there. But I'm so excited that I do have that because I know a lot of people who have been after the fact, there's really nothing much to photograph but rubble. So that's kind of a treasured piece of mine. But
Yeah.
I do know you have something even more rare than that.
I do. After hearing this story kind of way back when and doing some research, I discovered that there was a magazine written and put out by SB Publishing, which is in Somerville, and it contained like some pretty graphic but detailed photos, and it really went into the case details pretty extensively. But this magazine was it was from a short run. It was no longer available, very few copies being out there. So it was really quite hard to get your hands on one. And I kind of gave up on that idea of ever even seeing the magazine. And then I started renting a house for a short period of time that was in Tryon. And, when we were moving in, I was kind of up standing on the countertops, cleaning the top of the kitchen cabinets. And there was a copy of that magazine that I now proudly display in my home. And I display that alongside the black and white photograph that is the one you took. And I thought it was just really cool. They were perfect to go together.
That is the perfect pairing.
I know. It's a great display. And, to kick us off, I wanted to read something that is in that magazine. It was actually written by James Budd, who was the editor of the Somerville News at the time. So these are his words. He says, "The stale stench of death and decay clung heavily to the air inside the dim, cavernous manor the victims called Corpsewood. Near Joseph Odom's body in the kitchen was a drowned rat submerged in a pail of filthy water. In an adjoining study was the bound and gagged body of Dr. Charles L. Scudder, a former professor of pharmacology, who, just 6 years before, had traded his tenure for a peaceful manor on 40 acres in southern Appalachians. More than 20 spent shells, each of which found their brutal mark, littered the red-splashed floor. There are murders and there are slaughters. What greeted law officers December 16th, 1982, on a remote ridge in Chattooga County, Georgia, was the latter."
Wow, that's intense for sure. I've never read that. I knew you had the book, the magazine or whatever, and I know that a lot of people would really like to get their hands on that.
Mm.
So, well, let's talk about the first time each of us visited Corpsewood.
Oh, yeah. Well, let's see. I first heard about Corpsewood when I moved to Northwest Georgia. This was several years ago. My daughter heard the story because some of her friends, they were familiar with the story and they were familiar with that area. And so she talked me into going out to see the place. It was very difficult to find. And the path to get there was pretty eerie. Unfortunately, though, unlike you, I really got there several years too late, and most of the structure was already down, which is sad because I hear it was a beautiful place.
A lot of it was still standing when I went the first time, and it was beautiful in an eerie sort of way, like what you describe. It was kind of like a fairy tale to me. And so this was back in 1989 when I went the first time. I've probably been about 10 times total. So a friend had mentioned it to me, and I'd never heard of it before because, that was back in the day when you didn't just like look something up. You had to hear about it. And then if once you heard about it, obviously you had to go check it out. But, so we go out there and I'm walking and walking and thinking, we ever gonna get there? But then you come across this and it's just like, you know, um, a surprise out there. You're expecting it, but it's just, it's just something to see back in the day. And now I understand it's a lot of rubble now, but gosh, and the story, that goes along with it's just as surprising.
Yeah, this one was hard to hash out because the details are so gruesome. And no matter how you felt about the victims, they were human beings and should have never endured what they did.
I agree. Now, for this episode, we had the incredible opportunity to interview Amy Petula, who is a retired lawyer, author, and owns Chattanooga Ghost Tours. Amy moved to the Northwest Georgia area in '86 and practiced law there for 20 years. She co authored a book titled Haunted Chattanooga and is the author of Ghostly Tales of Chattanooga, as well as the book we're talking about today, The Corpsewood Manor Murder in North Georgia.
Yeah, she was able to give us some insight into not just the storyline and the paranormal side of this case, but the legal side of it as well. And a lot of that is reflected in her book.
Right. Well, she was very open to discussing the book and how she came to write.
I'd heard about the case from the time I came up here. Um, when I decided to retire, I started Chattanooga Ghost Tours. Much more fun, much less stress as a retirement job. And then I started hearing about Corpsewood from an entirely different angle. So, I had written one book for History Press, Haunted Chattanooga, and so when I got time to start writing a second one, this was just the perfect case because, as you said, I knew it both from the legal standpoint and then, from the paranormal standpoint to a certain extent. It was funny. History Press called me up and said, hey, do like after about 5 years after I wrote the first one, hey, do you want to write another book for us? And I said, well, I'm already writing another book, but it's a true crime. You guys don't handle true crime. And they said, oh, we have a whole division for true crime. So, so that's how I came to get the book published.
So
Wow.
Amy found herself in a small town with a community of other lawyers and authorities who knew the case very well. So she really found herself immersed in it. And before long, she actually started working with Chris Townley, who is the lawyer that represented Tony West on his appeal. And she found everything about this case to be just as interesting as we do.
It's a fascinating case. Like I said, when it first happened, it had international attention. They had a helicopter from a tabloid in Europe flying overhead trying to take
Wow.
pictures. So, and it's continued to fascinate people to this day. I tell folks it really is the most bizarre true crime you'll ever hear from, anything weird you can think of, from, LSD to a hand-built castle in the middle of the national forest, to the Church of Satan, all in there, all true. How often do you run across a tale that's got all that?
This really is a true crime junkie's dream. And if you weren't familiar with the validity of the story, you could absolutely feel like it was a work of fiction.
Yeah, but everything is absolutely true. Well, as soon as we learned that Amy was a lawyer, we both had a curiosity about whether or not she had worked on this case professionally. She said she had not, but she had interacted with Kenneth Avery Brock while he was in jail awaiting trial.
I wrote to both of them, and I heard back from Kenneth, the younger fella. So yes, and I know the only reason that he wrote back to me is because he thought I was a lawyer and I could help him, which I had no intention to do. But he did write back, and it was interesting to hear his perspective. So
Hmm.
I talk about it some in the book.
So she did
Wow.
correspond with the murderers, but we know that she did not have any interaction with the victims.
Right. She didn't know them. She moved here after the murders, but she did speak some on her thoughts and the opinions of others about these men. I'll be honest, my opinion has changed drastically through the years, and that has in part been because of how they've been presented by different people telling their story.
Yeah, I understand what you mean. Like I've heard many stories circulating about these guys, and what you hear, it really depends on who you're talking to. They had some very strange items in their home, many which can appear to be evil. And I mean, you just never know really where someone's heart is, and we don't need to. I have animal skulls and other really strange items in my home too. I own a deck of tarot cards. I have no idea what they mean or what to do with them. We draw clothes on the little people. I certainly hope that no one is judging me for the odd things that I collect.
Well, no judgment here, my friend. I love all the weird things too. I'll say their collection was a bit darker. So um,
Right.
maybe there is something to keeping a check on what you allow in your space. And maybe some things do even carry vibes. That's kind of the talk, right?
Yeah, and I do think that's a real thing. My daughter took a brick from there as a keepsake. It was a
Mm,
little portion of a brick, not even a full one, but she brought it home. It stayed in her room overnight. The next morning, she had me back up the mountain, hiking our way back out to that property. And she put it back where she found it. She just said it put off very disturbing vibes.
wow. Yeah, I mean, I kind of see that. I have mixed feelings, but I did always hear that you weren't supposed to take anything from Corpsewood Manor. I don't know if that's true, but I'll say I had mixed feelings about the place, and like I said, the victims as well.
Yeah. Well, recently we had a guest in our home. It's my fiance's older brother. He grew up in that area. And I knew he had been around the victims at some point. So, like, it was not long before I started asking questions. Well, no, it wasn't long before I was like elbowing my fiance to start asking those questions.
Right. Very interesting. So, what did you find out?
Well, he met Scudder and Odom at his 18th birthday party. So they were invited by a friend of his, they had a mutual friend. Um, so he hadn't known them up until that point, and his initial thoughts were that they were different, which makes sense because I mean they weren't from that area, and we do know they stood out. So the one thing that really stood out to him in his mind was an incident that was started by Scudder. So apparently he was like a pretty playful guy and would get into wrestling matches. And this particular day, he was cutting up with that friend that had invited him. And they had a hole. They had dug a big hole in the ground because they had they were going to roast a pig in it. Um, and the guy pushed Scudder into that hole, and my fiance's brother said he totally flipped out, like, it really panicked him.
Well, I can imagine. So,
Yeah.
did he see them again after that?
He did, and he eventually was invited up to their home, he hung out with them, he played with their dogs, he said he signed their guest book, and he discovered they were genuinely nice guys, like, they opened their home to anyone who wanted to visit. And you hear so much good come from those who knew these men intimately. Like people talk about how kind they were and their desire to like live their lives the way they wanted to, regardless of that like societal pull to be normal.
Yeah, I wanted to know more about these guys, who were obviously very different, living a different life than many, and how they ended up in Northwest Georgia town of Trine. And luckily, Amy was able to provide some additional insight on that.
All right. Well, Charles Scudder, eh, to me, he's like uh, the uncle and the Nutcracker. He's a really mysterious and charismatic character, like Drosselmeyer. And people say all kinds of different things about him. And I've mentioned before, more than any other case I've ever heard, people are more divided about the victims in this case than anything. Almost everyone uh, thinks they're either angels or demons. Perspective. My perspective is they're neither one. They're human. They had, there are good points and their bad points. So, um, some of the people who want to think they're angels don't especially care for me because I do talk about some of originally when I was talking about the LSD, they're like, no, that's not true. I'm like, well, there's this evidence that came in at the trial of 3 vials that would totaled 12,000 doses if they were full. One was full, one was half full, so that leaves 6,000 doses, and I don't think those other 6,000 doses just evaporated, as some of them would say.
Yeah.
But I think they were really, really fascinating men. Charles was a professor of pharmacology at Loyola University in Chicago, and the co-director of their Institute for the Study of Mind, Drugs, and Behavior. So, what kind of experiments he was doing, which, is where because this was government grade LSD that he had, labeled and tagged and whatnot. So, where that came from. And, Joey is very, very different man from him. And the relationship between Joey and Charles is another thing that's sometimes I think people get confused about. And it's hard to define because I think it was one of those deals where they were very close friends and they were, they lived together for more than 20 years, but they weren't like a couple. I think they may have had sex occasionally, for fun, but it wasn't like a marriage or anything like that. Although partners probably in a different sort of sense of the partner word would define that. But Joey was not, a highly intelligent person the way that Charles was. He was a little, I think the way I described him in my book is fey, a little childlike. But both of them really wanted to get away from civilization. Charles had been fed up with his, supercilious college students he was having to deal with, and the whole academic politics and all the crap. And his mansion was kind of crumbling, and the neighborhood was deteriorating. And so on his 50th birthday, he retired from the university, and they looked around for a piece of land that was completely surrounded by the national forest.
Yeah, these guys didn't fit the norm. It was almost, I'm going to say, like a midlife crisis for Scudder, but I don't mean that in a negative way. I feel like some people just wake up one day and they have, those natural questions about life and what it all means. And I feel like that's kind of where he was. And then there's like follow up to that. Some people shake it off and they stick to what they know. And then you have those that just make those drastic changes in life and they trade what is familiar to them and they it's a trade-off for what makes them happy. And I feel like that's where Charles Scudder was. But that does look odd to those who decide to stay on their path.
Well, we know that they probably looked rather odd to the people of Trine, especially those who'd been there, in the Bible Belt for their entire lives.
Mm.
But that didn't keep Charles from meeting people.
Yeah, that's right. And Amy talked a little bit about that too.
They wanted to be surrounded by the national forest. But the contradiction to that too was that Charles was a very uh, loquacious, extroverted kind of person. So being in the middle of nowhere, he still, had a lot of contact with people, whether it was, going to town, at the stores, people that he corresponded with, whatever. So, so that's how they wound up there. They loaded up the Jeep that they had, which had two huge inverted pentagrams on it, not exactly inconspicuous. Loaded it up with their two mastiffs who were massive, huge, and that was Beelzebub and Arsenic. 12,000 doses of LSD and two human skulls. And they came on down to Georgia and built themselves, as I said, a hand-built tiny little castle in the middle of the national forest that had no electricity, no running water. They built the walls triple thick with air between to insulate. So it actually was supposed to have stayed, pretty warm. It wasn't someplace that got really super cold in the winter or anything like that. Sort of like a cave. Came down in the 70s and were there for about 5 years before their murders happened.
So you have two men who look very different from those around them, but they were very different from one another. They came from very different backgrounds.
Charles's family, Charles grew up in a relatively wealthy family. He was well educated. Joey, complete opposite. I think he went to, I forget, like second or third grade, something like that. Poorer family. So they were from very different backgrounds.
Yeah, so these guys packed up and headed to Georgia with little more than a dream to be self-sufficient and live off grid.
Yeah, and there wasn't a lot of prep to it. Like they didn't rent a place to stay while they had a house built. I actually believe these guys camped out on the property. But they built everything they had with their hands.
And they came in the middle of winter, which was probably not as big a deal to them from being up north, but I
Right.
believe there was a pretty big blizzard that came through around the time of their arrival.
Got lost on the way down there, slept in the Jeep overnight, and they built themselves, I think they stayed in a tent and then kind of built themselves a sort of shelter while they were getting the first floor of the manor done and getting it under roof. Once that was done, I think they moved into that until they built the second floor. But they grew a lot of fruit. They had the chicken house, which is a little notorious because of some of the entertaining that happened on the third floor, but it did have chickens in it, on the first floor. So, they got meat from there. And, I think they did some foraging, some things like that, made their own, they had bees and made their own candles, beeswax, from the bees and the honey. And yeah, I mean, they were off the grid of a lot of people. A lot of people didn't know they were there.
Well, off grid sounds wonderful until you think through like all of the work of being truly self-sustaining. I don't know if I have it in me. Probably like a cheater version of off grid, but maybe not completely.
Yeah, it's a fantasy for sure, but that place is really off the grid. It's so barren that's literally why they called it Corpsewood when they got there, which turned out to be sort of foreshadowing of their fate.
Yeah, they lived completely secluded, but Scudder had a very friendly personality and he did mingle with people.
Yeah, that personality eventually led him to befriend Tony West and Avery Brock, two men who seemed to be as different as night and day.
Well, what happened is Kenneth Brock, or Avery Brock, as he's sometimes called,
Hmm.
um, was 17 at the time. He had, a kind of a rough childhood. I think his dad had kicked him out before. It sounded like his dad was a pretty abusive kind of guy. And he had never been in trouble before. That's one of the things I tried to kind of make a point about how weird Tryon was a town of like 1,700 people. And besides this case, it was also the location of one of the murders from Judy Neely, who's the youngest woman ever sentenced to death in the United States. It was where, oh gosh, of course, the other guy's name's escaping me right now, but another like really bizarre serial crime happened. It's right down the road from Tri-State Crematories, which is actually where the Charles and Joey's bodies, I think, were sent to be cremated. So for such a tiny town to have so many bizarre, like newsworthy crimes that happen in a tiny town like that is just astronomical to me. And with the crimes, like the guy who, the one that I said was really bizarre, murder where he cut his girlfriend to death. He'd never been in trouble before. Judy Neely, never in trouble before. It's like they hit trying and something really weird happened to him.
Yeah, I want to pause here. Have you heard of these crimes before?
Yeah, so I've heard about the Judith Neely case. That a long time ago, I heard of that. It was a really awful story that I heard when I was a teenager. So basically, Judith and her husband Alvin Neely took this poor girl from a local mall and tortured her, and then dumped her in Little River Canyon in Alabama.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Judith also killed another girl too at a motel. This was all about the same time. She,
Wow.
yeah, and she's called a monster by many for a very good reason. I
Yeah.
do know about the crematorium, and that's a crazy story, but I'll leave that for more talk in another episode. Wink, wink.
Yeah.
uh, yeah, I don't know that other one though that she mentioned. I'm not sure about that.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, I know the crematorium is a truly bizarre story. And I'm actually really excited to work on that one. Anyway, okay, so back to our story. We've got Avery Brock was 17 and really had not been in any major trouble. He meets Tony West. West was 30 at the time, and he had a pretty extensive criminal history. So then these guys meet Charles and Joey.
So Kenneth had moved in with Tony West, who was not a great influence, to say the least. But he'd been hunting on the lands of Corpsewood, and that's how he came to meet Charles.
So now we have Tony and Avery getting to know Charles and Joey. I heard they possibly bonded over the homemade wine that Charles often would make. You can't help but wonder, where did this all go wrong?
Yeah, and there are different stories out there about how everything went south. But, the short version is Tony West decided he and Avery are going to rob these guys.
And unfortunately, the men did much more than rob the homeowners of Corpsewood Manor. The story takes an incredibly deep twist, one that was very much premeditated and also involves a couple of local teens.
Yeah, they had some meetings beforehand about what to do, how to do it. They wound up taking a couple of uh, teenagers along with them. Joey Wells, and there's always been speculation about whether Joey Wells knew about it or not. Joey denied that he knew anything about it, but the murderer said he knew about it. He knew what was going on, and he got he was helping ransack the house or whatever. Um, he was Tony West's cousin. And then Teresa Hudgens, who definitely did not know anything about it. And she was like 17, and she was out on a date, I guess, with Joey Wells, and she had no idea what she was in store for.
So, I've always felt sorry for Teresa. She was blinded by this as the victims were, and she's had to relive that night ever since.
Yeah, I can't imagine. And, I often wonder if maybe she feels like that guilt by association or, has she gone through those events and thought of things that she could have done differently?
Oh, yeah, I could imagine so. And, she wasn't even able to go directly to the police. She was actually held for a week.
That's right. Yeah, the bodies had been discovered, but no one knew what had happened until she was able to get free and tell about what she knew.
She was held for a week by like I said, Tony West and Joey Wells were relatives. So she was held by, I think it was Joey's mother's family, which was Tony's sister. She wasn't treated badly or anything, but they didn't want her to go run off and talk to the sheriff. They wanted them to have a chance to get away. So, but eventually, when she was finally let go, she went to her family, and she's a 17-year-old girl. She's scared to death. She's like, "What do I do?" or whatever. And her family said, "You have got to tell the police." which she did. And I think in the meantime, they had discovered the bodies, but nobody knew what happened.
So we have West and Brock, who went to Corpsewood with the intent of robbing Scudder and Odom. They took Joey Wells and Teresa Hudgens with them, and they told the teens they were just going up there to drink some wine.
Mm.
After some time, Brock left, returned with a rifle, and after some commotion, West ended up tying up Scudder and demanding money, to which Scudder replied he didn't have any. So at this point, Wells and Hudgens left, and they went back to the vehicle that they came in, and Brock entered the house and shot Joey Odom 4 times and then killed
Mm.
both of the bull mastiff dogs that the couple owned.
Yeah, that is just crazy. And after that happened, they walked Scudder into the home. So Scudder had been in an outdoor, an outside building. Um, and he moaned, he's gagged, but he moaned when he saw Odom's lifeless body.
Mm.
And how heartbreaking. I mean, to have that happen and then see your friend there. At that point, West took Scudder into the library of the home and he ended up shooting him 5 times in the head. That not much was found in the home. As far as valuables go, what they took, I think it was some jewelry. There was a dagger of some sort, and that was really it. And I was kind of shocked to note they left behind a gold harp which at the time was valued at $10,000. They didn't think it would fit in their vehicle.
Wow.
Um, yeah, it's just all very sad, heart wrenching. And, one thing I found eerie about the entire ordeal was the artwork that had been completed by Charles 2 years prior to his death. He had done a self portrait, and in the painting, he's gagged, and there are 5 bullet holes in his head, which is exactly how his body was found.
Right. And this was not something he came up with on his own either.
It was Joey that dreamed that scene, and he told Charles about it, and Charles got up and painted it. So yeah, it's just one of dozens and dozens of really bizarre things about that case, but that's one of the more well-known ones, and one that you can visually see, so it makes it more real.
Very, very strange. It makes you wonder if Joey naturally had premonitions. Or was that just like a really specific dream that happened to come true later? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So I'm not sure how I feel about all that. It's super weird, and the painting's very macabre. It has like this powerful feeling to it. I know that sounds crazy, but it does. Like that
I
whole
get it.
place, yeah, that whole place has a feeling. But when you see those photos and those images of what was in there, it has more of an intense feeling to me. But
Mm.
um, I will say that when I first went to visit Corpsewood, I didn't I don't think I felt like a bad feeling. Not like I expected when you think of, the context. But as time went on, I think it had bad added to it, like brought back to life, the fact that it's all been torn down, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it has been ransacked, and you can go out there and see where people are they're doing some weird rituals out there. But yeah, there's definitely I get some kind of feeling from the area. Not it's not a scary thing. Like I said, it's a beautiful place. But there's definitely sadness there. You know, Charles Scudder was interviewed by Somerville News. This was in 1979. He was quoted saying, "I love being away from the city, and this was a change for the better." But his last words would come on December 16th, 1982, and they were, "I asked for this." Gosh, it's so much anguish in 4 little words.
Wow. What powerful last words. And, how far does that meaning go beyond what we even know?
Mm.
Um, Gosh, there's so many different angles to this story, and we want to thank Amy Petula for her input, which gave us more insight into both the murderers and the victims. What a dark and interesting story with so many twists. Carly, I'm sure this won't be the only time we discuss Corpsewood Manor, right?
Oh, it can't be.
Yeah, there seems to always be something more to learn about this dark and tragic case that happened so close to home.
We want to thank you for listening in, and we hope that you'll join us next time.
Well, listen, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, where we post exclusive content, contests, and so much more. And of course, you can keep up with our episodes through Podbean or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And as always, if you have a story that sparks curiosity or you have something that you want us to talk about, just shoot us an email to ourcuriouspodcast@gmail.com. We'll see you next time.